start recording.
Okay.
All right. So I'm going to turn this over to Sophia. Go for it.
Okay. Hi. Thanks, Lauren. As Lauren mentioned, I'm Sophia Elliot. I am the Independent Living Program Manager with the Division of Family Services. I'm really excited about this training. I'm always excited to get information out about the IL program to folks. So I'm really excited about today, and I'm also looking forward to all of your questions. I think questions are great. I think it helps, improve the system, and I'm always looking to improve things and make things work better. And I just wanted to pause real quick and just say thank you all for what you do. What you do is not easy stuff, so I just wanted to thank you all for the work that you all do with our youth in foster care. Okay, so I'm going to share my screen, and hopefully this will work. So I have a PowerPoint slideshow that I'm going to run through. It's going to be a lot of information. So like Lauren said, I can go over questions at the end. Okay, so why is independent living services important? It's important for a lot of reasons. We collect data and stats on outcomes of youth. Here's a snapshot of a few outcomes that we've collected earlier this year. Independent living services, the goal of it is to provide supports and services to youth to be able to be self-sufficient and independent young adults. So not going to go through the stats, but I just wanted to share them so you could see kind of where we are at right now with youth in Delaware. Okay. As I just mentioned, the purpose of the Independent Living Program is to prepare youth for adulthood. The goal is to provide the tools and the services to youth so they can be self-sufficient young adults. The division provides IL services to youth in foster care placements, starting at the age of 14, all the way up to the age of 21. So basically what happens is when a youth becomes eligible for IL services, the DFS worker will create a referral in our electronic database system called Focus. I think most of you have heard of our system Focus, but all of the work is done in that system. Okay. So as I mentioned before, youth are eligible for independent living services starting at the age of 14. So when the youth is in a foster care placement setting at 14 and 15, the primary person that is providing those IL related services is the DFS worker. It's not until the youth turns 16 that the referral to our contracted IL providers happens. So when the youth turns 16, that's when the referral occurs in Focus. The DFS worker is supposed to include information on the IL services the youth is receiving in the child plan and the child plan review. And then the contracted IL provider worker will also indicate the goals and services the youth is working on in their independent living case plan. One of the really great benefits that the Independent Living Program has for youth is credit reports. So starting at the age of 14, youth in foster care will have their credit run. DFS partners with an organization called Stand By Me in Wilmington, and they run the youth's credit report every year. We do this because unfortunately we have found over history that youth's credit is sometimes compromised. And so, to prepare them to be, on the right track when they turn 18, we want to make sure that we're capturing any fraudulent activity on their credit. Okay. So the Independent Living Program is partially funded through a grant from the feds. Independent living services happens across the nation. The grant is a federal grant, and so every state receives this grant. It's called the Chafee Grant. And so the way that the feds ensure that Delaware is providing the independent living services to the youth that they want us to be doing, they ask us to collect data twice a year to ensure that the outcomes are going in the direction that they should be going in. So some of you all may have heard of NYTD, which stands for National Youth in Transition Database. So as I just mentioned, it collects outcome information on youth receiving independent living services. We provide a report twice a year to the feds on the outcomes that youth have experienced with independent living services. In addition to the outcomes, the feds require us to take a point-in-time survey or have the youth take a point-in-time survey every 3 years. So when the youth is 17 years old in foster care, we ask the youth to complete this survey and ask them for their opinion on independent living services. We collect demographic information. And then when that 17-year-old turns 19, we ask them to do that same survey again. And then when that youth turns 21, we ask them to do that survey for the third time. So we don't survey youth, we don't survey 17-year-olds every year. It happens on a cycle, so it's every 3 years. It gets a little confusing, but I definitely wanted to mention this because if you hear that a youth is completing a survey, or if you hear of NYTD, you kind of have a baseline understanding of what that is. NYTD is also really good to know about because you can go online and look at some of this information for Delaware specifically, and you can also look at it from other states. Okay, again, who's eligible for independent living services? Youth that are in a foster care placement setting at 16 or 17, they can get connected to an IL contracted provider. If the youth age is out of foster care, so if they're 18 years old and in that foster care placement setting, they are eligible to stay with their IL worker until the age of 21. If a youth is 16 or 17 in foster care and they go to guardianship, or if they're adopted, they are also eligible to have that IL worker stay with them until the age of 21. If a youth is 16, 17 years old and goes on trial reunification and returns to their bio family, they're only eligible for 60 days of IL services, and then it ends. Delaware has also chosen to support youth that have been placed in our state that have aged out of foster care from other states. So for example, if a youth ages out of foster care in Pennsylvania and then moves to Dover, we will connect that, that youth with an IL provider. All right, IL providers, who are they? We've contract with 5 different providers. We contract with West End, People's Place and Progressive Life in Newcastle County. West End also has transitional living, which I'll talk about in a little bit. We also contract with Elizabeth Murphy School in the Dover area. And we also contract with Dunamis Dominion. Now, Dunamis is only transitional living, and they are in the Camden, Wyoming area, as well as Laurel. And then, of course, we have People's Place in Sussex County as well. So like I talked about before, when the youth is eligible for the referral to be connected with the contracted IL worker, the DFS worker will complete a referral in focus. They will provide the IL contracted provider with the youth's essential documents, such as their social security card, copy of their ID. and then the IL worker will process the referral and make a connection with the youth. The first couple things that happen when the referral is accepted is that the IL worker will complete the CASA life skills assessment to kind of get an idea on where they are with learning about IL related services. I feel like I'm going very fast. Usually when I do this training, we have questions that happen throughout the conversation. So I feel like I'm going really fast. I'll try and slow down maybe just a little bit.
Sophia, do you want us to ask questions in the middle, or do you want us to hold questions to the end?
Yeah, why don't we pause and do some questions now?
Okay, perfect. Does anybody have any questions?
I don't have a question as much, but just to say that I actually work with an infant. So I came across ILS in the context not of a CASA kid, but as a CASA parent. So I found the ILS worker to be so helpful in connecting with the parent, getting a little bit of their background. So just to flag for my other CASAs, that sometimes that can be a really useful, great resource for use of ILS as well.
I just have a quick question is, how do we get DFS to actually get this process started? I have a child who turned 16 in middle of pandemic, but I'm struggling to even get the basic counseling and things done for him. How am I going to get him hooked up for IL services?
Yeah, great question. And thanks for sharing about the positive experience you had with the baby and the mom. Also, I just wanted to thank you for that. So in regards to getting the youth connected with IL services, so when the youth turns 16, it's flagged in our system, and I send reminders to the DFS worker to complete the referral, and I always include their supervisor on the email as well. So the DFS worker should be aware to make the referral in the system as soon as the youth is eligible for services. Of course, right now it looks a little different because we have to be really careful with the social distancing and face-to-face. But the IL workers, they're still doing what they do. So they will connect with the DFS worker, look at the contact information for the youth, which should be included in the referral and focus. And then, they'll start working with the youth, whether it's, starting with a phone call, initiating that service, that working relationship. The IL providers, each provider is managing this whole COVID situation a little differently. Some are doing, some social distancing visits. Some are able to have the youth in a van where they're, socially distant from each other, and they're able to take them over to like the DMV or, social services. I want to highlight that the IL providers, the ones that I mentioned, Murphy, People's Place, Progressive Life, the IL staff all have access to Focus and do all of their work in Focus just like a DFS worker does. So there's like a continuation of information.
I have a question. So if a kid applies and gets denied, are they able to reapply?
Yeah, that's a great question. So youth that are in foster care at the right age are eligible. There shouldn't be any reason why they would be denied. The only thing I can think of for like a 16 or 17-year-old would be if they have a disability that's so significant that they wouldn't benefit from the IL services. But when the youth is over 18, if they're incarcerated, then IL services ends. But then if the youth is released, then they could re-engage in services. So just to kind of go off that piece a little bit, if the youth becomes ineligible, like they're incarcerated, or if they turn 18 and they're like, you know what, I don't want to have any more workers, I don't want to have any more support or help, they can always re-engage in services until the age of 21. So there's that time frame that even if they say no thanks, they can always come back and re-engage in services.
Sophia, what happens if a youth is living in another state and is eligible for IL services? How does that work?
Yeah, that's another great question. So again, back to the eligibility criteria, youth that are in that are 16 or 17 in a foster care placement setting are eligible for independent living services. So if they're under 18 and they're placed out of state in one of our foster care residential providers, the hope is that that provider is going to be able to work with the youth regarding IL services. It should be a part of the youth's case plan, and it should be a part of the work that agency does with the youth. So we typically like to see the provider where that youth is placed to help them with those IL services. If the youth is getting really close to aging out, they're 17 and a half, and it looks like they're going to age out of care at that facility, then we would work with the IL providers here in Delaware to see if we can connect them with an in-state provider to help with that transition as they age out of care. Now, sometimes this is getting a little more case specific. If the youth decides they don't want to come back to Delaware, then it may not make a lot of sense to connect them to an IL provider here in Delaware. So that's when I would reach out to the state that youth is living in and see if we can get them connected to IL services there in that state.
Gotcha. I have a follow-up question then. How often does that happen where a referral is made to the independent living providers in the other state? How often does that work?
It happens, I don't know, infrequently. I would say like, it doesn't happen too often. Like maybe once every 2 months or so.
Okay.
We have
and if it doesn't work, does it not work because either the youth doesn't want it, or the youth doesn't qualify, or that state doesn't have an independent living program?
So usually the youth are interested in engaging in services. It's more rare that they're not interested in services. I have found that not every state will work with a youth that has aged out of care from a different state. So Maryland, they're really difficult to work with, but Pennsylvania, they're great. They typically work with all of our youth that have aged out of care in Delaware. So yeah, so it depends on the state, but every state does have IL services. Any other questions at this point?
No, why don't you move on? And then how about if anybody has questions, you can use your raise your hand feature at the bottom, or just unmute yourself and say you have a question. I've got a couple questions that I'm writing down, but you might get to them, so I'm not going to ask them yet.
Okay, great. Okay, so as you all can see on the slide that's been up, there's multiple different kinds of services that the IL worker will work with the youth on. So money management, educational support, career planning. They'll help them with daily living skills, home skills, lots of things. So some benefits, again, with the IL program include housing vouchers. So there's two different types of housing vouchers. There's the SRAP voucher, which is the State Rental Assistance Program that's funded by the state. And then there's the FUP voucher, which is the Family Unification Program that's funded from the feds. So we have a set amount of vouchers that we are allotted, and the youth can use them to have significantly reduced rent. The Education and Training Voucher, also known as ETV, is also funded by the feds. It's this really great opportunity for youth that go off to post-secondary education. So, if they go off to college, they can apply for the ETV stipend, and then they can get up to $5,000 a year to go towards tuition, towards room and board. They can also use ETV for indirect costs to support them going to school, such as daycare, transportation, ETV. You may know about ETV because it's actually now housed over at OCA. This is the first year that it's been housed over there. I think we had close to 40 or 50 youth apply for ETV this year, which was the most we've ever had, which was really exciting. Then, of course, there's the assist stipend, which I'll talk about a little bit later. Some other incentives or some other benefits include incentives such as when a youth graduates or gets employed, the IL provider can provide them with monetary incentives for those different achievements. Okay, so hopefully most of you have heard of the STEPS meeting. It stands for Stairway to Encourage Personal Success. STEPS is a transition meeting that is supposed to be youth-centered around when the youth turns 17 and a half. Basically, the meeting is an opportunity for the youth to be able to advocate for themselves and talk about what they want to do when they turn 18. They can highlight the goals that they have for where they want to live, what they want to do about their job, or if they want to go to school. We just changed policy around STEPS, so the practice is a little bit different now. Hopefully we've made it a little bit more efficient, but the IL worker is supposed to do a like a prep form, like a prep document with the youth to help the youth to begin to think about some of these goals and areas of topics that will be discussed during the meeting. At the meeting, it's supposed to be the DFS worker, the IL worker, the child attorney in CASA, and then the youth is supposed to invite other supports they have in their life, particularly those that will be there for the youth when they turn 18. So 90 days before the youth exits care, so 90 days before the youth leaves foster care, they're supposed to have an exit meeting. The exit meeting is when the DFS worker is supposed to give the youth their original forms of their social security card, birth certificate, all those essential documents. At the exit meeting, that's kind of where the team can come back together with the youth and assess where they are with working on the goals that were identified during the STEPS meeting. Okay. So as I talked about before, youth are eligible for independent living services until they turn 21. So that's basically what that slide says. Okay, transitional living. So we have two providers that we contract with, West End and Dunamis Dominion, that has transitional living. Transitional living basically means supportive housing. So we have units where we have staff that will come in and check in on the youth. And basically it's to help prepare the youth to be able to live independently in their own unit.
I have a question, Sophia. Where are those physically located, like town-wise?
Yeah. So West End has transitional living. Their transitional living programs called Lifelines, and they're in Wilmington, right on the same block as St. Francis Hospital. And then we have Dunamis Dominion in the Camden, Wyoming area, and Dunamis also has another unit in Laurel. And just to mention, Murphy School has in the past had a few units available for transitional living. Currently they don't, but that's something that I think that they would like to do in the future, just so that you all are aware.
Sophia, back to the STEPS meeting. Is that ever revised? You do like a career plan at 17 and you got a child. Well, my young man actually has changed his mind about 3 times and he's not even 18 yet. Does that ever get updated or shouldn't it be?
Yeah, great question. So as I mentioned, the whole STEPS practice has recently changed just this past year. So right now, what it looks like is within 30 days, well, let me back up a little bit more. So when the youth first begins to engage with the IL worker at 16, the IL worker should be completing the steps prep form with them at that point. And then they should be reviewing it with the youth every like 6 months or so to prepare them for that steps meeting. The steps meeting should happen about a year later, around within 30 days of the youth turning 17. And then we have the steps plan. So it's like this kind of very similar to the prep form, but it's kind of, it outlines the goals that was discussed, with the youth and the team about, what they want to do when they turn 18. So between that 17 and 18 birthday, the team and the youth are supposed to work towards those goals. And of course, yes, they change, especially with this population, they're going to change a lot. And that's okay. And that's why we have so many folks around the youth and supporting the youth to be able to help them figure out those goals. So as I mentioned, the exit meeting is supposed to happen 90 days before the youth turns 18 to review what was discussed during that steps planning meeting. So I hope I answered your question.
Okay. It's the exit plan is only if you're leaving. I'm trying to come up with the right words. If you have, what's it called, where you stay with a foster family until you get out of high school, extended jurisdiction. Is that?
I think it's a board.
Exit meeting during that period of time, or when that expires?
Yeah, that's a great question. I'll talk about board extensions again towards the end of the slideshow. But yes, there would be another exit meeting that's supposed to occur if the youth is on a board extension. It becomes like very technical. So basically, you can think of it as if the youth is on a board extension for another year to finish high school, then another exit meeting should occur. I'm sorry, my cat is trying to join this PowerPoint slideshow. Okay, so most of you may have heard of ASSIST. It stands for Achieving Self-Sufficiency and Independence Through Supported Transition. So the ASSIST stipend was created back in around 2012, 2013 with the participation of youth and the Delaware Youth Opportunity Initiative. It's a really great benefit of the IL program. Let me see if I have it on more next slide. Yeah, okay. So when the youth turns 18, they are eligible for the ASSIST stipend if they're working with their IL worker. So the goal of the ASSIST stipend is to, the goal of the ASSIST stipend is to prepare the youth to be able to be financially independent, I guess. So basically, the stipend helps fill in the gaps for when a youth first ages out of care. So, of course, when the youth turns 18, they don't have a lot of, financial support. So the stipend allows for them to be able to have access to a security deposit or to be able to help pay for groceries. So it's a needs-based system. So if the youth has income, the IL worker will work with the youth to figure out what their monthly budget would be. And basically the stipend is going to just fill in the gaps. The youth could get up to $1,000 a month, but again, it's needs-based. And so the youth is typically not going to get $1,000 because the goal is for them to have employment to be able to pay for some of their expenses. Any questions about ASSIST?
I had a good experience with the program because I understand money management has to be, the kids have to take a test and have a passing grade to be eligible. And my young man had, for various reasons, I think it took him, they were very cooperative and gave him a break so he could finally pass it on his, I probably shouldn't tell you this, but like his third try. So anyway, if your child comes up short on that, don't give up. I think in our case, the IL worker really did him a real favor, because without passing that test, you're not eligible for the funds, right?
Correct. Yeah. Thank you for bringing that up. There is a tool that we use. It's online. It's called Money Skills, and it's a course. Basically, it talks about very watered down economics, money management. It has a lot of really helpful information in it, but we ask that all youth take that and pass it, because the idea is that we don't want to be just giving youth all this money every month. We want them to be responsible, and we don't want to set them up for failure. Any other questions about Assist? I would like to mention that youth that turn 18, they're eligible for Assist, they're working with their IL worker, and they decide to leave the state for whatever reason, maybe it's to go to school in a different state, they are still eligible for the Assist stipend, but Assist is unique to Delaware, and so they wouldn't be able to get it from the state that they're in. So what we've done is we, at my office, we stay in connection with the youth and oversee their Assist stipend. So the IL worker is really not connected with them anymore. It's more at my office that we ensure the youth is still getting that stipend. So I wanted to mention that because some folks forget about that. Okay, so Education and Training Voucher, as I mentioned before, it's this really great program that helps youth offset some costs when they go off to college. So I already talked about it, so I'm going to go ahead and just go through that one. All right, the Youth Advisory Council, also known as YAC. YAC is an opportunity and mechanism for youth in foster care to be able to advocate for youth in care. So prior to COVID, we were meeting once a month, the third Wednesday at Wesley College, and we would, the youth would get together and they would talk about what was working well in foster care and what wasn't working so well, and identifying ways to improve the foster care system. YAC is really cool because teens in care come and they get to hang out with each other, they get to connect with one another, and YAC is youth-led. So every July there's elections that occur, and the youth vote on a president, vice president, secretary, and editor. So it's a really neat experience for youth to be able to have opportunities of leadership, to be able to practice speaking in front of their peers. And there's also opportunities for them to meet legislators. The First Lady has come to a few of our YAC meetings over the past year. So now with COVID, we have our YAC meetings over Zoom, which has been quite an experience. But it's really cool because the youth, it's really fun to see the youth in leadership positions. So also with YAC, we have an annual conference. We actually just had it last week. It was a very modified, watered down conference because of COVID. We had it at Killen's Pond. So it was a fun day, but it was, of course, very different because of COVID. You can find there's a little video clip of some youth performing their talent show on our department's Facebook page if you want to check that out. Okay, here's our board extensions. So, so board extensions basically allow a youth to remain in the foster home to finish school. So if a youth turns 18 and they still have, one more year left of high school, we want to be able to support that youth finishing their education. So the youth and the foster parent, along with the DFS worker, has to sign an agreement to agree that the board extension is something that everyone is in support of. As I mentioned before, the exit meeting should occur again if the board extension happens longer than 6 months from the youth turning 18. So an exit meeting happens when the youth turns 18. Board extension is in place. 6 months goes by, another exit meeting has to happen before the board extension ends. Okay. Now, extended jurisdiction, not to be confused with board extensions. Extended jurisdiction is simply an opportunity for youth to be able to continue to go to court, connect with their family court judge, and maintain their child attorney. Youth are supposed to petition with their child attorney after they've turned 18 for extended jurisdiction, also known as EJ. EJ hearings is a way for the court to review the independent living services the youth is receiving. So the IL worker is supposed to be attending those, not the DFS worker. I feel like I should have like a trivia question here. So a youth can be on a board extension and extended jurisdiction at the same time. A youth can be on a board extension and not have extended jurisdiction. Extended jurisdiction is not tied to board extensions, and extended jurisdiction is not tied to independent living eligibility. Questions about EJ?
If a child turns 18 and did not decide to sign up for extended jurisdiction, but then like a month later or something decides that they do want extended jurisdiction, is that too late?
No, they can petition for extended jurisdiction. I think it's up to 6 months before they turn 21.
Okay, thank you.
Yep. And then, of course, a youth can terminate EJ. I think technically they have to do it in writing, and then the child attorney would, send that off to the court and terminate it. All right, so talking about termination, I did touch on this a little bit before. So independent living services after the youth turns 18 is voluntary. Most youth continue to engage in IL services. It's, like I said, very rare that a youth does not engage in IL services after they've aged out of care. But again, if a youth is like, you know what, I'm not working with an IL worker, a DFS worker, no worker ever again, and then a year later, they're like, I would like some, support, they can re-engage in services. Any questions about termination of IL services?
Sophia, I don't have a question. Oh, sorry. Okay, go ask your question, then I'll say something after.
Okay, thank you. After a child turns 18, if they move back in with a parent, but it's not really, they're no longer, like, it's not really a reunification because it's past, or like, I don't know, do they lose IL services still just for living in the house of a parent?
No, so if they've aged out of foster care, so they were in the foster home when they had their 18th birthday, and then on their 18th birthday, or whatever day they've moved back in with their bio family, they're still eligible for services. It's only when they're under 18 and the division supports trial reunification, that's when they're only eligible for 60 days and then it ends.
Okay, thank you.
Mm-hmm.
When you say trial reunification, does that have to be with one or both of the biological parents, as opposed to moving in with a sister or an uncle or something like that?
It could be one parent or two parents. I think it depends on what on the specific case. So if the youth was removed from living with the sister and then goes back to living with a sister, I believe the division would look at that as trial reunification, because they're going back to the home that the division deemed unsafe in some way. So if they were removed from a bio parent and then started living with a sister, that may not be trial reunification depending on the case plan.
Okay.
So Sophia, I'll just mention something from the CASA perspective. So the CASA, when it comes to termination of IL services, you may see this more often than not where it's terminated based on the youth's sort of refusal or just inaction or just not wanting to participate in the IL programs anymore. So kind of the first two dots that Sophia has on this PowerPoint seem to be, at least in my experience, seem to be kind of the most frequent, and or they just don't want to come to court anymore. So remember, extended jurisdiction really just extends the involvement of the court and the legal entities, which would be the court and the CASA. So sometimes sometimes it's because they're doing well. They've got a job, they've got a house, they're fine. The last thing they want to do is come to court, and that's fine. But that's one thing I would suggest as a CASA is just kind of keep in touch with your youth, which is now a young adult, of do they still want these services? And some absolutely do, but some of them don't. And I can't speak for all judges, but most of the judges will allow a youth to miss 1, maybe 2 court hearings because they're generally only held twice a year anyway, the court hearings are. But once they start to kind of pull away, that's when it might be worth having a conversation with the child attorney about whether or not termination of independent living services might be best, because it's kind of hard to force the court piece on them. So that's what you might see more often than not, is just kind of they're no longer interested in coming to court.
Thanks, Lauren. Yeah, there's definitely confusion around how extended jurisdiction and eligibility for independent living services works. So the baseline is a youth aging out of foster care at 18 is eligible for independent living services until they're 21. And if they want EJ, they can have EJ. If they don't want it, then that's fine too. Oh, and that's the last slide. So other questions?
Sophia, I do have a question about the independent living worker. So you showed a slide about all the services that were offered. What, how often is the independent living worker required to meet with the youth or anybody else?
Yeah, so they're supposed to meet with the youth at least once a month. I think that most IL workers see most youth, or at least connect with them, more than once a month. Pre-COVID, they were visiting them at school, helping them, youth were coming into the IL workers' office. So now with COVID, it looks different. They're doing lots of Zoom and FaceTime, and I think some of them even are connecting over Facebook. So yeah, so at least once a month, but I think it's happening generally more than that.
Who are the IL workers in Sussex?
Great question. So let me go back to that slide. We have People's Place and Dunamis Dominion in Sussex. But like I said, Dunamis Dominion only does housing. So the workers in Sussex would be with People's Place. The director is Christina Jones Bay. And there's also another People's Place IL worker. Her name is Amanda Lee.
Question, Sophia, what's the best way for a CASA to communicate? So say they've got a youth who is 16 or 17. So let's assume they're not an adult yet. So they're 16 or 17. Anytime there's an issue or a concern, what's the best way for a CASA to communicate both with the independent living worker and or the DFS worker? Kind of what's sort of the best line of communication?
Yeah, so I would always start with the IL worker, if it's related to the IL services, or the DFS worker. And if there's no feedback, or if you're not getting anywhere with either of those two different workers, I would include the supervisor. And I usually always suggest folks to include the supervisor from the beginning, because the IL workers and the DFS workers are running 100 miles per hour in different directions. And so it's helpful to have someone else there to be able to respond to questions over email. So I always suggest including the supervisor when you're connecting with a DFS worker. And if you can't get anywhere with the IL worker, please include their supervisor, which are all the directors listed on this page. Murphy School right now is going through a transition, so they don't have an IL director right now. It currently is Melissa Bridell, but please include them in the conversations. They want to ensure that their staff are doing what they're supposed to be doing, and want to be addressing any concerns or any issues. And if for some reason you feel like you're not getting anywhere with the directors on this PowerPoint slideshow, on this PowerPoint slide, please include me. Like I said at the beginning of the slideshow, I welcome questions. I want to improve. I want to continue to identify things that are not working well, because in the end, it's just going to affect the youth, and we want best outcomes for them.
I have another question. Sorry. When it comes to court hearings for 16 and 17-year-olds, for court hearings, do most of the time both the DFS worker and the independent living worker attend?
So if it's a review hearing, post-permanency hearing, any type of court hearing when the youth is under 18, then the DFS worker has to be in attendance. If it's not the DFS worker, it's someone else in their place. The IL worker should be attending. They should be invited. I know I've heard from staff that there's sometimes a communication gap with that, but the IL worker would very much appreciate to be not, in the know when court hearings are, so they can provide an update. As I mentioned before, all of these IL workers here on this slide and their staff have access to focus and do all of their work there. So they put their notes in there, they put the IL plan in there, they put the Casey Life Skills Assessment in there. So the DFS worker does have access to all that information so if there was for some reason the IL worker wasn't able to attend a hearing, the DFS worker does have access to all this information. When the youth is attending their EJ hearing, it should only be the IL worker that attends that hearing.
Gotcha. So one thing a CASA can do to kind of assist with communication and make sure everybody's on the same page is if you know when the next court hearing is and you have an independent living worker, make sure to invite them. I know I've had that challenge a couple of times where the independent living provider either didn't get a court notice or doesn't know of the court date, or for instance, the court date changed and never got an update. So one simple thing that CASA can do is just make sure the independent living worker knows when the next court hearing is.
Yes, I would. Yes, definitely agree with what you just said. We have found that the biggest gap is when the court hearing is rescheduled. That's when the IL worker seems to not know about the hearing. So more communication about the hearings, the better, because we all want to be around the youth and supporting the youth at those hearings, at any hearing. So if we can continue to encourage more communication about the hearings, the better.
Those are all my questions, I promise. Does anybody else have any questions? Awesome. All right, hearing none. Sophia, thank you so much for doing this presentation. We really appreciate it.
You're welcome. Thank you for having me.